Well, hello everyone. I'm going to do this live, but I'm on Saturday. Jane and I are going to be doing a program about enlightened people we have met. So I thought before we do this show, it would be quite interesting to first of all just give you some of my ideas about what I believe and what I think is enlightenment, because there's many people out there that claim to be enlightened. There's many definitions of enlightenment, and it's puzzling sometimes, I think, for people coming to this subject to understand exactly what we mean by enlightenment. So my talk with you today, and I expect some of you will come online in a moment with me too, can ask me questions. My talk today is going to be about what do we mean by enlightenment? What really is enlightenment? Because if you think about it, today there's so many people, particularly with the internet, in which we bandy around all sorts of phrases that they get taken completely out of context. For example, we often talk about gurus, don't we? But a guru is a bringer of the light. So a guru really is somebody that brings the enlightenment to people, really. But we now use the word with all sorts of things, don't we? We talk about a property guru. We talk about gurus for who are a guru of marketing, or a guru of this and a guru of that. So we get a lot of phrases and a lot of words completely out of context nowadays that are all about a distortion of the original meaning of the word. And this particularly applies to this idea of enlightenment, because many people out there make claims to being enlightened, or they look upon their teachers as being enlightened beings. And I think things get very confused for the seeker, of who is someone who is looking to try to understand what enlightenment is and how can I achieve it. So before we can say what enlightenment is, I think we have to first say what enlightenment isn't. First of all, there's the whole idea of people get confused. They look it up on the internet and they'll find things about the Enlightenment movement, which was a philosophical movement that happened. Now, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the idea that some people can enter a state of awareness, or whatever you want to call it, in which one moment they're an ordinary person and the next minute they're enlightened. This is something that was particularly brought forward with the idea of the Buddha. The Buddha spent years and years living as a sadhu, really, acting and living in ways that most of us couldn't possibly live by, going through all sorts of terrible deprivations. He starved himself near to death. I mean, I went to Varanasi in particular, where there is the deer park, where the Buddha first gave his first talk about enlightenment and the rest of it. And before that, he'd lived with all those sadhus down by the Ganges. He was basically following what would have been a traditional Hindu way of going down a path of renunciation, of pushing everything in life away, of moving everything out of his life, until that there was longer any more attachment to the material world, and one enters into the higher state of awareness that I suppose you could call enlightenment. But it's a word that got particularly moved around with the idea of the Buddha, because if we look into the old Hindu ways, we also see there that they talked about samadhi as being a sort of the same word really as enlightenment. That when one goes through the meditative states, the mind slowly becomes quieter and quieter, and over years and years of practice, sometimes a person will get a glimpse of what they call the samadhi. And sometimes they will enter that state, which is called samadhi. And if the person persists, and in Patanjali, we read about that there can be samadhi with and without seed, that one can enter a state that is beyond even seed, that there is no seed of you left at all. And we also read about it and hear about it with people like Ramana Maharishi, who says to keep looking and asking the question, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? And with this attitude, we gradually come to the idea that I am the absolute consciousness. But it's not an intellectual thing that someone comes to, it's a realization. So enlightenment, people think that, there's this state that we can enter and we work towards, we get to the enlightenment state, and suddenly everything changes, everything's different, we are no longer what we were. But enlightenment doesn't come sort of like with a snap of the fingers, although I suppose it does come in Zen a bit like that. It comes after years, lifetimes of work, of hard spiritual work. The Buddha didn't suddenly become enlightened. He had done many lifetimes of work before that, before he could enter this peculiar, strange state that is very hard for the intellect to understand, which we call enlightenment. We can only really describe enlightenment by describing what it's not, because everything we see in this world is determined by our perceptions and determined by our response to those perceptions with our mind. So even if we close off all our perceptions and we go within ourselves, we're still in a state of mind. We understand everything we do is, I am experiencing this, I am experiencing that. We always have somewhere in the equation this sense of I, this sense of who I am. There's somebody experiencing this moment, even if it be in meditation in a blank state of a moment of consciousness. Somebody there, the I, is experiencing the nothingness. And you can't really say that the enlightenment is no mind, because that's still a relative state of some mind. You see what I mean? It's impossible to describe it in normal terms. It's knowledge, but it's not knowledge in the sense that intellectual knowledge. We can't use our brain to comprehend it. In the same way, in the Zen teachings, they describe it like the mind as being like a sword that can cut, but cannot cut itself. So we can perceive something, but we cannot perceive its own self. And this is the conundrum that we're in when we come to this idea of finding enlightenment. What is enlightenment? But then sometimes almost out of the blue, and I think this is not just something that happens just to the great gurus and teachers hidden away on the mountains of Tibet and the Himalayas and Peru and wherever they may be. Sometimes each of us comes close to that enlightened state. One way is sometimes just that happens in ordinary situations where suddenly there's a sense of the absolute beauty of being. Now, that's not the enlightened state, but it's kind of on the edge of it. It's kind of close to the level of that existence where we understand bliss. Bliss is not the answer. Bliss is not the final state that we should attain. But sometimes bliss comes to us out of nowhere. A beautiful scene, a sudden memory, a moment, an unexpected moment. There's this sense of this oceanic feeling, this sense of being great, a great being, of being something that's part of something huge, a feeling of the oneness of the universe. That, in my opinion, is the edge of the enlightenment, as it were. It's like a sense of it. It's like we can almost smell the rose, But the enlightenment itself goes even beyond that, because the bliss is only the edge of it. There's a state beyond all existence, beyond all normal understanding, beyond anything we can comprehend with our normal mind, that is absolute, that is final, that is beyond anything we can possibly express. It can only be described in ways that it's not. But we might describe it as light, but it's not light. We might describe it as infinite love, but even that is not enough to describe it. We might describe it as infinite consciousness, but even that is not enough, because all these things are relative phrases, you see. Everything that we experience in the enlightened state is beyond what the experience of the I. You see, I am, you are. We know that. We can't get away from that fact that we exist, that we have some form of identity. But that I that mysterious sense of being, that mysterious sense of me, that a thing that we can observe, but we can't, we have an observer of an observer, as it were. We can never get to the essence of it. It's a sword that cuts but cannot cut itself. But that I actually, in reality, is part of that awakening, that enlightenment. So what I'm saying is not something you achieve, or not something that you go to, or not something like a swimming pool that you jump into, or an infinite sea of existence. You're already in it. We're already in that enlightened state. And sometimes we get glimpses of it. We get feelings of it. Every person at some point in their life gets those moments when for fractions of a second, you might understand that I am more than this. And that state is when the self, that I, and the infinite are the same thing. We realize that they're the same thing. But it's not this death. It's not a destruction of ourselves. It's not like a lot of people misunderstand the idea of enlightenment as if we've got to destroy the brain, or we've got to almost kill ourselves, almost in a way. There's almost a death threat sort of feel to the idea of enlightenment. No, nothing is ever lost. Ignorance is lost. That's what Buddha talked about. He talked about the ending of ignorance, that nirvana was the snuffing out of ignorance. It was the putting out of the light of ignorance so that awareness and awakening can come. But what happens is that we're like sugar. We're like a crystal, like a salt, like a sugar, that we have formed, that our consciousness, our personality, those things that survive death, for example, still exist, but we drop them, as it were, into the infinite ocean, and the sweetness spreads as part of an infinite ocean. So I think enlightenment is a word that has been so misused and so often compromised by people with huge egos. I think when people have the first stages of what I would call an enlightened experience, of when you first get a glimpse of that infinite existence, and maybe even for a short while completely become part of it in a way that is beyond nobody could ever say to you, this isn't true, because you know it is the absolute, there's nothing beyond this. But sometimes people come out of it almost in a narcissistic way, that instead of the feeling of the self being pushed aside, the self comes back almost with a hugeness of ego, and that very experience that you had is squashed again into the darkness of ignorance. So I think when a person enters that enlightened state, different people of different levels of understanding will understand it in different ways. It's not something that can be artificially induced. It's not something that can be given by somebody else to you. Nobody can do it for you. It's one of those states that is beyond normal knowledge. It's beyond rationality. It's impossible to describe. And yet each of us, I think, in our hearts knows it. Some would call it God. But God is becomes something that is separate from ourselves. God is not separate. You see, when people say, do you believe in God? I often have to say, well, it depends what we mean by that. But if we mean that each of us is part of this absolute, each of us is part of this infinite bliss, infinite understanding, infinite peace, infinite knowledge, then that's what God is. But then I am God, and you are God, and we all are God. So I wanted to sort of express these things first, because as I said at the start, on Saturday, Jane and I are going to talk about the sort of enlightened people we've met. But I think it's important just to come to an understanding of what do we mean by enlightenment? And this is where I want your questions. What do you think enlightenment is? And would you like to ask me any further thoughts about this? Because how do we also recognize somebody that's enlightened, you know? Because a lot of people claim to be enlightened, and we look at them and think, wow, they're far from being enlightened. A lot of people claim to be psychics and mediums, but they're far from being that. I suppose we can only judge by their fruits you shall know them, as Jesus said, didn't he? Because we can only judge a person by their conduct. You know, what is a person who is enlightened like? We can judge it by their conduct. Has that person realized the absolute existence, and therefore is filled with, for example, love or compassion, or that person is filled with a lessening of desire and requirement of the material things of this world, and can see beyond those things. You know, it's very hard nowadays for people to really understand what enlightenment is, because we live in this age of Kali Yuga, and there's so much ignorance associated with it. And to me, enlightenment is beyond time. Enlightenment is the unity of all existence. Enlightenment is absolute love. Enlightenment is the kind of ending of all relative thought. It's beyond knowledge. It's beyond anything we can possibly think or make up or be. It is absolute. In fact, I often think of it as Shiva, you know, like the little statue I got in the background, Shiva, which means that which is not. And that's not something negative, but we can only describe it by describing what it is not. Shiva means that which is not. And so that's my thoughts. That's my thoughts on enlightenment. I'd like to sort of get some of your ideas now. And we'll be talking about this on Saturday, Jane and myself, about kind of the people we've met who sort of have been a bit enlightened, and also some of the sort of more eccentric sort of people we've met, and some of the remarkable people we've met in our time and on our journeys through life. So let's have a quick look at some of your questions now, because I've got them. I haven't got anybody working with me today, so I've got to look. And thank you for all your hellos. Nice to see you all, guys. I see there's lots of you there saying hello and so forth. So let's have a look if you've got any interesting answers and questions here. That's quite interesting, actually. Hi, Jason. I see you come on a lot, don't you? Beware of those who enjoy tooting their own horns. Yeah, the real deal should shun the attention, yet their reputation should precede itself. My observations. Now, isn't that now bang on? Isn't that really, Jason? I mean, if you check out people that make claims about being enlightened on the internet, you think to yourself, well, how can a person claim to be enlightened? You know, the very act of doing that is kind of a denial of it itself. I mean, I remember one Japanese sage said, didn't he? What was it? He who knows, he who speaks knows not. He who speaks not knows. You know, I mean, in many respects, it's so beyond normal description, so beyond knowledge, that those that toot their own horns, as you say there, are often the ones that are furthest from the truth. Okay, so John's here saying, good morning. I do not think one can just start yapping about enlightenment. A mood of sorts has to be created. In a way, that's true, actually. I think that's quite an important observation. I found that one's understanding of it often comes if you're talking with other people who are on the same wavelength, not arguing about it, but talking about it as, you know, who are we, and working together. And often I find that meditation circles, because I used to do particularly a lot of psychic type circles, and although they were aimed at psychic development, often we would move it towards spiritual thinking. And often when you meet others and you talk together, it brings you closer to an understanding of what we really mean by this. So listening to me or listening to anybody can only stimulate the thoughts, but often it needs our direct perception, doesn't it? You don't think enlightenment, you realize enlightenment. Yeah, that's pretty true, actually. Perhaps people confuse spirituality with enlightenment, because I think, you know, the whole question is not always attaining this sort of state. We overstate the importance of this word enlightenment, don't we? What really is important actually is spirituality. And what do we mean by that? We mean the way we live, our conduct, our attitude to life. You know, have we learnt all the basics of how to live, and how to live in a loving way? I mean, have we learned things like equanimity within ourselves? Have we learned non-violence? Have we learned things such as purity of heart? Have we learned to live and walk through this world as if the whole world is consciousness or God or whatever you want to think of it? You know, have we developed the sort of right attitudes? I mean, that is the work. That is the work that is done, because first I think we have to become morally good people before we can become spiritually awakened. And it's no good. An awakened person who has none of the moral foundations is probably not a particularly useful person in the world. So thanks for that question. I think that's very interesting. And which I see you've picked up here, Yeon. Before people can reach enlightenment, they have to overcome greed, anger, and ignorance, you know. And how do we overcome those things in our lives? I think, again, we lack in society at the moment any real moral guidance. And I don't really mean by that, I don't like the idea of moral codes and things that are imposed upon us by some external force like a religion. But there are basic ways to live that we know in our conscience that are the correct ways to live, aren't there? We know that things like greed, anger, ignorance are negative things. We know that egotism, we know that all those horrible things that all of us carry around to some degree and another are there. So how do we overcome those things? I think the best way to overcome the bad, the evil, which is in ourselves as well, is energetic progress in the good, to work hard towards what we know in our heart to be good things. So enlightenment is also very much tied in with humility, with modesty, with the idea that we are not that important, that it's about the one, it's about the collective rather than the individual needs. So I think that's hopefully that's some more thoughts there for you. So that's interesting. What's you having to say there? Enlightenment occurs in different themes and subjects. I know my enlightenment is in religion, and I think religion can be a helpful path for many people. I always like to distinguish between the difference between what we mean by religion and what we mean by spirituality, because the two are not necessarily the same thing. Religion, of course, should embrace spirituality, but for many people, religion has becomes a way of getting easy answers, doesn't it? It's a bit of a teddy bear for some people, because when you think about it, you know, people like to be told what to do, and on a spiritual level, unfortunately, it's the same. People think, oh, you know, tell me the answers, and then it's easy. But the thing is, the answers aren't easy. The answers require each of us to look at the good and the bad and to realize that religions and all everything in the world is polluted in some way. And to find the truth, nobody else can tell it to us. We have to have personal, direct experience of the truth. Only our experiences, your experience, is valid. Every other experience can be useful. It can take you towards it. Of course, the great teachers, the great beings of the world can guide us on the path. But ultimately, the only person that can ever enter that state that we called enlightenment is you. No one else can do it for you. So that's my thoughts on that. That's an interesting thought too there, Lu Chu. If people spend more time working towards enlightenment than speaking about it, and I'm guilty there, sorry, it's true, but it's true, our world would be an amazing place, you know. And even if we did a little bit, even if each, how much time does any of us spend working on our spiritual path? You know, do we spend 50% of our day? No. 10% of our day? No. 1% of our day? Probably not. We don't even have moments where we even think about the joys of existence. We might watch YouTubes and things, but it's still, are we spending our time truly developing our consciousness, developing, maybe using techniques to do that, or even in our actions and the things we do in our day, in our karmic yoga, as it were, what the things we do from day to day in our normal lives, you know? That's an interesting thought too, I think there. You're saying eye of the needle. I believe that true enlightenment comes through suffering and sacrifice. I think there's an element to that, you know, because in our lives, all those that have really attained the higher states of consciousness have usually been through some pretty tough times first. And it applies to all levels of spirituality, actually, not just the highest levels of enlightenment. I mean, even working as and becoming a medium, and not just me, but other people I know who are genuine mediums and the healers have usually had some pretty rough times in their life that have pushed them away from an easy life and pushed them on that difficult path that is the spiritual path, whether it be like developing mediumship or developing healing or developing spirituality to the point that one goes and that becomes your lifestyle, you know. And that is very, very true. Eye of the Needle, which is an interesting name. We do, don't we? We have to sometimes go through a lot of suffering in order to see, or even to begin the quest, really, to seek beyond the obvious, you know, to seek beyond the comforts of the world that's so enticing all the time. It's so easy to put your feet up and, you know, you know, people think, oh, everything would be fine in life if I won the pools, or not the pools, that's at my age, win the lottery, you know, and I could put my feet up, I could have cocktails on the beach all day. But then, you know, that's not the answer, is it? Because that is still all the things we hope for and crave for are ephemeral. They go away. There's no lasting happiness in those things. There may be temporary pleasures. I'm not saying one should reject the world, but we got to have more. We got to be really greedy. We've got to go for the real top. We've got to go to understand things that is a happiness that is beyond the temporary of the world. We, as the Dalai Lama says, we seek happiness in the wrong places. You know, we should be seeking happiness in the inner world. You know, I often say it's important that we learn to live from the inside, not live from the outside, because I think that is the first step towards this state we call enlightenment. You know, that we have to live on the inside, that our focus is within ourselves, for not in a selfish way, but we're focused within, and then we do the work without, you know. And in that way, I think we come closer to the truth. And that's true as well. I agree here. You know, this is a really good point. Suffering aids enlightenment development. It goes to support the notion that evil has a purpose in this world, which many do not agree with. Very deep thoughts you have, Nick. You know, brilliant. That is so true, actually, isn't it? That how many of, you know, the people, when you think about the people that we might have called enlightenment, the great teachers, you know, whether it be whoever, Buddha suffered, all the Siddha yogis and people, all those Indian yogis, most of them had gone through some suffering, sometimes deliberate suffering, to get there, tapas suffering. In the Christian faith, I mean, Jesus was suffered, St. Francis suffered, all the saints suffered, but suffering is not necessary completely. But I think it's part of the process. It's part of the shedding of ignorance. It's part of the shedding of the ego. It's part of the realizing that what is important are not the ephemeral changing things of this world, isn't it? You know, in India, there's a yogic groups that that almost reject the world by living a disgusting life, you know, drinking out of skulls and cannibalism and things like that, as if to get to the point that if I induce so much suffering on myself, or if life becomes so intolerably disgusting that my brain will look to higher levels of consciousness. And that's the extreme of that idea of suffering. I think all of us have to find a middle way, because, you know, suffering in many ways is optional. You know, because bad things come to us naturally, but whether we suffer or not is our choice of how we react. And people that I think transcend suffering have understood that suffering is optional, that I can still, my body can suffer, my mind can suffer, my world can suffer, but I can actually find that point beyond that. And that's perhaps where we're getting close again to what the enlightenment might be. You know, living again from the inside, living in a centered state, living with perfect equilibrium. We walk through the world without being blemished by it. So that's another thought, you know. I mean, I'm not saying I've got all the answers here, guys. This is why I want your questions, because, you know, these are thoughts. These are thoughts about what each of us must have on our path towards full understanding of this world. So let's take a couple more questions now to see what you have got there. So yeah, that's, see, again, referencing some of these thoughts again. Thanks, that is through suffering we take a new look of the world. Anyway, I think I'm going to finish it there, because I think there's some interesting thoughts, and I thank you all guys for joining me. And we're going to be doing some more of this on Saturday. So those of you that follow the channel, and if you come onto this after I've gone live, because this was just a random one, I felt like talking, you'll be able to join me and Jane as our normal time on the live channel, which is going to be on Saturday evening at 7 o'clock. We're going to talk about some of the enlightened type of people we met, in our lives, Dalai Lama and people like that, and all the funny sort of people we've met who are kind of on a spiritual path, but a little bit eccentric sometimes. So we're going to share a few fun things with you as well. So that'll be 7 o'clock UK time, as usual, on a Saturday. So I look forward to seeing you all there. And if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe, click that little bell so you get your updates, and give us a like if you've enjoyed this little chat that I've had with you today. So going to see you soon. Bye for now, folks. See you soon.